Welcome to Kitchen Table Finance, the podcast where we serve up bite-sized pieces of financial advice to simplify your money and your life.
Hey Dave, how you doing today?
Doing great, Nick. Feels like it's been a while.
Yeah, sure has. Life goes on. People get
We had
busy.
a week off. We took a week off, and here we are back at it.
We had a week off. We had some coal action sprinkled in there.
Yeah.
We're back to Podcast Friday.
Back to the old team. All right.
Yeah. Today's topic, Dave, is all about buying houses in retirement.
Housing decisions.
Trickier than it used to be, for sure. There's some dynamics at play, but one of the things that you always talk about is, there's no perfect time to buy a house, right?
No.
Like there's always going to be something going on in the housing market that makes it not ideal.
Right. I think people have a false sense of stability about the housing market, or maybe that's not the right word for it, but everybody's in tune to volatility in the stock market, right? Because we see it all day, every day. It's in your face. You can punch in your account information and see what your gains and losses are on a daily basis. We don't think about housing that way.
Right.
I don't want to overstate that either. I think what I was getting at when I say that too is sometimes you got to be opportunistic,
right?
And the right piece of property, the right house, and the right situation. It's a little different.
That decision-making process is, people get so wrapped up in it. It's like, yes, houses are expensive right now, but if you're selling one, that means you get more for it, right?
Right.
There's no world where you sell your house for more money and then go on the market and everything is less expensive all of a sudden.
All things being equal. Yeah. It's usually apples to apples.
Yeah. Yeah. And people get so wrapped up in, well, maybe I should wait until housing prices come down or interest rates come down. And it's like, you can't time, just like you can't time the stock market, you really can't time the housing market either.
Usually what people are talking about as they're rolling into retirement is downsizing.
Yeah.
Going from the house where maybe you raised your kids and, lived in for 20, 30 years.
Right.
And for a variety of reasons, it's time for a different venue in retirement. But usually it's about downsizing.
Yeah, unless you're my wife, who insists that we need to keep our house just in case our kids want to come home for Christmas one year.
Yeah, well, we get that a lot too. Got in our little notes here to make sure we talk about the emotional sides of all this. But that's definitely one of them.
Oh, for sure.
There's a sense of attachment a lot of times. We'll get Michelle some of those little red velvet ropes, and maybe she can put the kids' names on the ropes, like we'll rope it off like a museum.
So emotions definitely play a part, just like any financial decision. One thing to think about as we're looking at today's market, where it exists today, and part of the problem that we're kind of seeing in the market as far as downsizing goes, and we're going to run through some examples here later, but there's a lot more competitions right now for smaller houses, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you've got this whole generation of kids that are living in their parents' basement that have decided that they want to join the real world to buy a house.
Yeah. It's a function of, profitability and what makes sense for home builders over the last 20, 30 years. I think an analogy I've used with folks is it's kind of like cars, right? Car makers found they could make more margin, more profit by putting more bells and whistles in vehicles until it's almost, you can't buy the things that were add-ons when we were kids are now standard because they found they can build that markup right into the price. With home builders, they found they can make more per square foot of house building a 4,000 or 5,000 foot house with all the luxuries instead of like the 2,000 square foot ranch house or smaller that starter homes, fall in that category, but also on the back end, downsizing. That's usually what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's just not enough of them.
Yeah, and it just makes a challenging. So you have less houses and more competition, more people trying to buy the houses. Just general supply and demand insist that prices go up at that point. Right.
Anecdotally, it seems like that the market swings like a pendulum, and I don't have numbers on this, just observation. It seems like a lot of that is poised to change. Like builders seem to be building a lot of stuff in metro areas I've looked at. Another consideration for retirees is, getting a mortgage, or how are you going to pay for the house?
Yeah. I think just in general terms, people don't realize that, they assume, well, I'm not working, so I can't get a mortgage, right?
Right.
Like I need to have
Right.
income to get a mortgage, and
Yeah.
that's not necessarily the case.
We help retirees get mortgages all the time.
Yeah. It's just one of those considerations. If you have assets, generally counts towards your income. And so getting a mortgage isn't an impossibility. It's actually pretty common for retirees. Flip side of that is, a lot of people believe that you should have your house paid off and you shouldn't have a mortgage in retirement. And one of the underlying things about downsizing is maybe you had a big mortgage, you still have some left on it, so you want to get a
Right.
smaller house and get rid of the mortgage payment, right? And there's some pros and cons to that we'll kind of walk through. But I think that's a lot of what kind of drives that downsizing conversation as well, is
Yeah.
sell our big house, not have a mortgage anymore, get a smaller one with the equity that we built up. And what does that look like?
Yeah.
Another consideration going on right now is we have higher interest rate environment, right? And so
if you do have to borrow, it's going to be more expensive.
So if you're borrowing, you're looking at 6.5% to 7% for a 30-year conventional, depending on how much you put down. And then, obviously interest rates go down slightly from there if you're borrowing in shorter terms. And so there's some thought that needs to go into, do I want to pay off my mortgage in retirement? We do, and we have clients on both sides of this, right? So we have some that are like, I'm never going to pay off my mortgage. It's not that big a deal.
Right.
My kids or my, whoever my beneficiaries are will just sell it, pay off the mortgage company,
and it'll all work out.
And all work out. Convinced they need to have no mortgage. And then there's some people that kind of fall in the middle of like, well, I'd like to pay it off in 15 years, so I don't have it throughout my retirement kind of thing. And so there's some consideration that goes into that.
With retirees, we're usually not borrowing because they don't have the money to buy the house. It's a question of what's the best use of their money. And that's different than when you're 28 years old, you're buying a house where you're scraping together a down payment and borrowing based on your income for the next 30 years, 15 years, 30 years. So a lot of time it's about like, what's the best use of your money in terms of reducing taxes, keeping flexibility, keeping liquidity.
It's not uncommon for our clients to use investments to pay for, new houses or that transition of house. If your equity that you have in your current house doesn't cover all of the new house. And then it's just a matter of figuring out like, okay, what types of accounts do I have, right? Do I have, after tax investment accounts that, there might be some tax on some gains, but generally not, terrible to pull a large lump sum out of. Is everything in pre-tax retirement accounts where all of a sudden whatever I take out of this account, I'm paying ordinary income taxes and potentially compounding my tax issues by taking large lump sums out? Or do I have Roth funds that I can pull out tax and penalty free? Like there's a lot that kind of goes into that decision-making process on the tax side. Outside of that is the opportunity cost, right? So do we reasonably feel like we can do better than the 7% mortgage given your risk tolerance and kind of how you're invested at this stage of the game or not?
That was a much more investment friendly conversation a couple of years ago when interest rates were at 3% or 4%. And in retrospect, that worked out pretty well because the markets did well. But that interest payment is a fixed and guaranteed cost, where in the investment world, the returns are going to be variable and not guaranteed in the short run. 6 or 7% is a pretty high bar to match. So again, taxes have to be figured in, and that's going to vary by individual situation. We look at that as closing that gap between the mortgage interest payment and the hypothetical return. If it's also going to cost you 30% in taxes, then that investment cost or mortgage cost isn't as necessarily as far off from the investment cost.
There's, again, different schools of thought on this, and a lot of this has to do with like what type of person you are. And this kind of taps into that emotional question of, are you going to be so worried about having to make your mortgage payment that it kind of paralyzes you from doing other things and enjoying life? Versus, are you going to be okay with that extra risk of having the mortgage, but also having the investments? On the one side, if you have investments and a mortgage, it gives you more flexibility, right? It's pretty hard to kind of tap into your equity in your house. I
Yeah.
mean, there's ways to
Yeah.
do it, but it's not,
It's not
it's not as
easy.
easy as
Right.
just taking money out of your, investment account. So those are all kind of considerations as you're making these decisions that you have to think about. But,
Yeah.
we always start all of our financial plans at the base level, and that is, what are your goals, right? Like,
What are you
what's
trying
most
to do?
important to you?
Yeah.
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 What are you trying to do? Is having this new house where you can potentially age in place for the next 30 years, where your current house doesn't fit that bill? Is that super important to you? Is that high on your priority list?
Right.
Or not necessarily? Like, those are the conversations you should be thinking about, not necessarily what's the best financial decision.
Yeah. And part of what compounds this kind of thinking and makes it more difficult is envisioning like what you're going to want to be or be able to do in terms of upkeep and maintenance. And it's hard for a 58, 60-year-old to imagine like how things are going to change over the next 10 years or 12 years or 15 years in terms of what you can do. And that yard that may be kind of fun to take care of on Saturdays when you're in your 50s. I don't know who that is. I hate yard work. I've talked to people that enjoy it. I think they lie. Think about realistically how that's going to play out. And, I guess, I think what we're getting at here is you maybe aren't technically downsizing in terms of cost, but if you're downsizing in terms of workload, stress, and maybe adding things that do allow you to age in place, such as a bathroom that's got the, safety features and maybe all on one floor, or, eliminating some of those things that may get difficult as you age, that's worth something. And we always are thinking in terms of trade-offs, right? Like what would you, if you stay in your house and you're not able to deal with it yourself, you're going to end up paying someone to help you with it, or you're going to be moving when you didn't necessarily plan on it. What do we hate? We hate surprises, right?
Yeah, right.
And as financial planners, we always are trying to like map out as much as we can in advance, because if you have to make decisions in a hurry because all of a sudden you've put yourself in a physical situation where you can't do the work, then that can cost more.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I mean, I think we do a really bad job as homeowners. I'm lumping all of us in here, of just really understanding what those costs are and how they add up, right? And maybe I'm jaded right now because I got to have somebody come take a tree down, and I got woodchucks living under my front porch that somebody's got to come deal with. But every year it's always something, and it seems like the bigger the house, the bigger the yard, the more that stuff comes up. And I think we do a bad job of parsing out, and the older the house too, right? Parsing out what those new expenses will be like compared to where you're currently at.
Yeah. And we tend to discount what we've spent over time in terms of cost too. And that plays into one of the other points we have on here is a lot of people are very reluctant to rent.
Yeah.
But if you've actually understood the true costs of your home ownership,
right,
sometimes renting is not, especially depending on the market, isn't necessarily a bad way to go.
Yeah, well, we've all, as Americans, been sold the bill of goods that the only path to true wealth is through home ownership, right? We've all heard that, and we've all
government policies going back to the 30s have convinced us of that.
Yeah. So we've taken that to heart. Whether we chuckle about it, but we all kind of deep down believe that. And in some cases, that's potentially true, but in other cases, it's not as true. There's other ways to build wealth and to have that than just through home ownership, right? And so, renting, especially with the current interest rate environment, the current, issues with getting people out to your house to do work for you, like contractor costs, all that stuff is going up. And renting, while it's going up, it isn't going up as fast as some of those other things are going up. So it's looking like a much better deal. And we've done podcast episodes on this before as well. And obviously it changes over time, but it's getting to a point where renting in a lot of locations, depending on where you are, is actually a much better deal than home ownership.
Yeah.
So I would definitely, like you said, I wouldn't just discount that because we've been told by the government that home ownership is the only way to successfully building wealth, right?
Yeah.
It's got to be a personal choice. And we have clients that rent and are perfectly happy, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe they'll buy houses someday, maybe they won't, but they're happy where they're at. And just think of how much flexibility it gives you when you can call someone up and say, hey, this is
Mm-hmm.
broken, come fix it. But also
Mm-hmm.
to leave and not worry about what's happening with your house. You know what I mean? There's a lot of
Yeah.
benefits and flexibility to that renting that you don't have with home ownership necessarily. So like you said, I definitely wouldn't just discount it because, that's what you've heard all along. Your money
Yeah.
script of home ownership is the only way to wealth, right?
Yeah.
So I did kind of write us a little bit of a scenario that I think
Yeah.
is playing out across the country right now. Obviously, the numbers are different depending on where you live, but it's a pretty decent.
Yeah, this is a middle of Michigan kind of
Yeah,
scenario. Just add
right.
a zero if you live
Yeah,
on one of the coasts,
yeah,
but
exactly. So the problem becomes right now in terms of like the actual gain of downsizing is, let's say in this scenario, we had a house purchase of $250,000 30-year loan that you purchased 15 years ago. You got that 4% interest rate. Your
yeah.
payment with taxes and insurance is probably clocking in at around 1560-ish, somewhere
Mm-hmm.
along those lines.
Yep.
And so 15 years later, right, you owe at that point 156,000. The good news is the market's up, so you're probably looking at selling it for about 400,000. And
Yes.
after costs and expenses and paying off your mortgage, you're netting about 200 to 220-ish in,
Yeah.
general
Yeah.
profits. So, you're probably feeling pretty good about that equity
Yeah.
and
Nice
being able to
chunk of
roll that
equity.
in.
Yeah.
And then the problem becomes on the other end is now we're looking for that downsize home. And because the
Mm-hmm.
market is where it is, you're probably looking at, 350-ish in this example, right? Like you got a smaller house, it's newer, but it doesn't cost that gap between, your big house and the new smaller house is probably not as big as what it used to be. And so that becomes problem number one.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take that 200,000 and you roll it into the down payment, so you use that as your down payment and you finance the rest at today's rates for another 30-year mortgage, your total payment after taxes and insurance is sitting at about 1,320-ish, we'll
Mm-hmm.
say. So it saves you, but it only saves you about $240 a month. So then
Right.
you're
In terms of
looking
cash
at it,
flow.
yeah, in terms of
Yeah.
cash flow, monthly cash flow. So then you're looking at, okay, I have a smaller house, but I'm only saving a little bit of money.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think is why a lot of people are sticking around, and we haven't seen a lot of people selling as many houses
Yeah.
because of that, getting rid of that mortgage. Now, a couple things. What part of what makes this a bigger issue is one of the good things about the way that property tax laws rule is you have capped tax rates, which means that your property tax can only go up 3% a year in the state of Michigan unless you have an uncapping event, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so what happens is your house growth, which is great, grew at a much faster rate than 3%. So you are paying taxes at probably a much lower rate than what your actual property value is. But one
Yes.
of those uncapping events is purchase/sale, right? So when you buy the
Yes.
new house, you actually probably end up paying more in taxes for the smaller house as well because you were paying
It's going to
taxes
be
based on
reassessed. Yeah.
3% a year from 15 years ago, where the new house, you're paying the full boat of taxes, right? So that's
Yeah.
one thing. And then the second thing is the higher interest rates, right?
Yeah. Where we
And
end up
then,
with a payment that's only $240 less than our other payment, because even though we're borrowing much less because we've put that
right.
$219,000 down, our monthly payment is still right up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as I'm sure we've all experienced, insurance costs are going up. That is probably similar
Mm-hmm.
to what you were paying before, but still higher than it has been in a while. And then
Yes.
I'm sure there's people out there, but I know every time that we have moved, there has been home improvements that needed to be done
Oh yeah, yeah,
relatively
yeah,
quickly.
yeah.
And not only
All
in the
the
old house to sell it, but also in the new one
right,
to move
right.
in.
Which isn't necessarily too big a deal, but it requires cash outlays that you've
Yeah,
got to factor in. And they can be pretty significant.
for sure. For sure. And then moving costs and all that stuff.
Of
And
course.
so, some potential solutions to that are, instead of taking out the mortgage, you could use investment funds, right? We
Hmm.
talked a little bit about the taxes and things like that. If you want to use retirement funds, you probably want to be smart about how much you're taking out in a single year. And maybe you get more of a bridge loan where it's shorter term and you're taking bigger chunks out to pay it out over multiple years as
Yeah,
opposed to all at once. There's a couple
yeah.
different ways to do that.
We've both worked those scenarios with clients where maybe they're taking a 15-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage, but we're really planning to pay it off in 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
Or somehow some formula that makes sense for their taxes to spread that cost out.
There are solutions, and what I would say about it too is I would never tell someone, don't buy a new house that's puts you in a better situation, especially if it's
Hmm.
high on your priority list, right? Like if one of your top goals is getting into a house that you have less maintenance on and can age in place, like if that's one of your top goals, and I wouldn't let any of these things get in the way of doing that, as
Hmm.
long as your plan can handle it, right? Like,
Yes. Yeah.
obviously you don't want to spend a bunch of money you don't necessarily have and put yourself in a bad spot.
Yeah.
But for
Yeah.
most people, that's usually not the conversation we're having, right?
Really, if you think about it and like the bigger, like think about your personal balance sheet. Say we need to take money out of retirement funds or investments to bridge that gap. What we're doing is moving money from one type of investment to another. If you think about how your personal net worth looks, it hasn't really changed. You've just moved some money from liquid investments into kind of illiquid home equity, right?
Right.
I'm not going to get too wrapped up in the potential return of one versus the other. That's going to vary, but I think for all practical purposes, you probably end up in close enough to the same place as far as that goes.
Yeah.
So really what we're thinking about there is how best to use your money to make it happen.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think too, people get a little too wrapped up in, this is something that we were taught in, financial sales school 101, right? Like, you can't eat your house, right? Like,
Right. Right. Right.
well, there,
Just true,
and
but
yeah, it is true. But there are actually lots of tools out there. The couple that come out to mind is, let's say you put everything in the house and you needed to get some of that equity out. You can do a cash out refi. You can do a home equity line of credit. You can do a reverse mortgage. There's been a
yes.
lot of bad press on reverse mortgages, but if you get the right reverse mortgage company, we've done them here, it has worked out. Like, they're not
Yeah.
as bad as they seem, especially with a lot of the new regulations and things. So
Yeah.
they're a good
Yeah.
tool for the right person in the right situation.
Yeah, lots of misunderstandings around those for
Yeah.
sure. The bottom line is, in a pinch, there's lots of ways we can access equity if we need to.
Most people, especially in this particular scenario, right, you're at well over 20% down payment as well. And the other thing that we don't always recognize is, yes, interest rates are where they are right now, which is historically average, right?
Yeah.
But they could potentially come down at some point, and probably will. And that gives you the opportunity to potentially refinance at some point as well. People forget about that too, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
the benefit of buying the house now is eventually, when you get lower interest rates, you'll be able to refinance, as opposed to waiting until interest rates go down, because the house values are probably going up at that point.
Yeah.
Lots of things to consider. I think overall, Dave, the big thing is everybody's scenario is a little bit different. But what I would say is, don't just be scared off by what you've heard about retirement or the current housing market. We have a lot of tools, a lot of different ways that we can get you into the house that you want to be in, that's important to your financial
Mm-hmm.
plan. It's just kind of a customized decision around who you are, what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
But it is a lot easier
Priorities.
there's a lot of ways to do it. But once you kind of you figure out your priorities, what you want to do, what feels best for you in your financial situation, I think it's a lot easier than maybe it is made out to be.
Yeah. All right.
As always, been a pleasure. If our listeners have any questions about their housing decisions or scenarios they're working on, feel free to shoot us an email at info@srbadvisors.com. We love to hear those things and kind of the financial challenges you're working on. So with that, Dave, until next time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining us for another chat about your retirement and finances. Please hit that subscribe button. You can also contact us at srbadvisors.com or email us at info@srbadvisors.com. See you next time on Kitchen Table Finance.
This is a Zedia Media production.